So I thought today that I would explain um, and see whether um, talking about some of the changes from a different perspective can actually be a piece of information that comes in and helps you look at it a little differently, especially that mm, that whatever's changed based on what I say. So a question that might come up, or a question that did come up this week from someone is, why is it that I listen to all these different teachings and that, it just, something doesn't happen. And it's like, what is the missing piece? What do I need to know to make the change happen? Why isn't the change happening? And the answer, as I see it, is that what is listening, who is listening, has a particular structure. And that structure is impacted all the time by whatever is happening on the outside world. And teachings are one of the many things that are happening on the outside world. And so the information is being delivered, or the practice, or whatever the teaching delivers, is being sort of thrown at the seeker, a bit like throwing a ball at a dunking machine in a show, in a fair, and whether the ball hits or doesn't hit, whether it hits but hits hard enough to get the person to dunk or not, all of those factors are what they are. There will be a reaction based on all of the variables at play. So if someone throws a ball with an amount of force and it hits the pad, but not with enough force to dunk the person, then the dunking doesn't happen. If someone throws the ball and the ball misses the pad, then the dunking doesn't happen. If someone throws the ball misses the pad, but a big gust of wind comes sufficient to push the panel, then the dunking will happen. If someone throws the ball and it hits the pad hard enough, the dunking will happen. So there's all these different variables, and the outcome is dependent on these variables. So the seeker is a particular entity being impacted by the words, by life. And what change happens, how the change happens, is not in our control. So you can have two different seekers listening, and they're hearing the same words, and one of them just gets frustrated and has no sense of what is being spoken of. It just seems very foreign. Whereas the other is listening to the same words, and suddenly it's like, I get it. And so the one that isn't saying I get it will look, the person next to him and say, so what am I missing, or why does he get it and I don't? And it's not because of an effort. It's not because someone is doing it right and the other person is doing it wrong. It's just that the two instruments that are receiving the input from outside are different. So if the psychological identity, which is part of the seeker, part of the biological and psychological makeup of the human being, if that identity is very, very, very contracted, then the words may not land. They might land, but just make very little headway into dissolving that identity. If another seeker has a psychological identity that is much less intense or much less concentrated, then the words come in and they might just be sufficient to dissolve or to break or to change significantly that identity. So the example I used was, if you have a knotted piece of fishing line, and the fishing line is really pulled tight in lots of different ways, and there's lots of tight knots, then just picking at the fishing line, at pieces of the fishing line, isn't going to change the situation much. The fishing line will remain heavily knotted. If, on the other hand, you have another bundle of fishing line that is sort of knotted, but none of it is tightly pulled, and none of the knots are tightly closed, and with a few pulls here and there, you might find that the nest of fishing line sort of opens up. And that essentially is the same actions are happening from the outside, some light pulling. And with one, clearly, there's not going to be any significant effect. And with the other, the nest of knotted fishing line unravels. And so it's simply about the structure. And we don't tend to appreciate that there is a structure that is deeply ingrained, and that everything that happens through us, all of the feelings, all of the thoughts, all of the actions, are a result of that structure. And in this teaching, the structure is described by the terminology, your genes and up-to-date conditioning. And genes and up-to-date conditioning is the way of pointing at what leads to the structure. But in fact, if you're listening to sounds which are part of the up-to-date conditioning, if you're a baby listening to people talk, what we know is, from observation, is we can see that the baby learns over time how to speak by listening to the new conditioning that is coming in moment after moment after moment. And the learning of how to speak is because the structure of the child or of the baby changes, such that it was a structure that couldn't produce words, couldn't formulate coherent communication, and at some point there's a noticeable change. Words are able to be formed, and it becomes clear that it's because some sort of cognition is happening that is leading to coherent, or the beginning of coherent communication. And so the new conditioning being the words of the parents talking to each other, the words of the parents talking to the baby, are obviously changing what we could just, for the sake of clarity or just making the example simple, it's changing the neural structure of the brain, the neural network. So my best guess is that once we learn how to communicate, once we understand language and we start developing language, the neural network is very different. It's always changing. So I would say even learning a new word, the definition of a new word, not only as a baby, but even now, changes the neural structure. That the new word and the understanding is known because the neural structure supports it. The neural structure allows that to be understood. And if we forget what a word means, if we forget what a movie was about, or anything, if we forget, it means that part of the neural structure has changed, because it means the neural structure isn't supporting the remembering. So whatever happens, the neural structure is changing. So that suggests that on a micro level, the neural structure is always changing, because we're always receiving new input, learning new things, forgetting things. And so the suggestion I'm putting forward is that we know whatever we know, we don't know whatever we don't know at a particular moment, because our structure supports the knowing or the absence of the knowing at a particular point in time. And so from this perspective, let's not lose track of, or focus of, the fact that these talks and spiritual seeking, the spiritual process, as explained by the concepts within this teaching, is really all about a change in the human being, such that the human being changes from having an experience of life that is full of suffering, and suffering in this context means an uncomfortableness with oneself, which in practical terms, that uncomfortableness presents itself in the form of guilt and blame and pride, worry and expectation. And within those major categories, there are lots of subcategories of different forms of shame or guilt, different forms of blame, different forms of pride, different forms of worry, different forms of expectation. So, as an example, under blame, there could be forms of judgment about someone for the way they look or the way they act, where you are holding them personally responsible, seeing them as a separate doer that is ultimately in control of their actions, and judging them, essentially blaming them for being how they are, and that judgment fits under the category of blame. And under the category of guilt, we might feel guilty for something that we did in relation to a friend or a family member, because we didn't do something, maybe something that we said we were going to do and we didn't do it, and then we feel guilty. So that's one form of guilt. But then there are other forms of guilt which are a guilt for not being good enough on a fundamental level, which when that's the case, it means guilt has gone beyond being guilt for a particular event or outcome, and where there is a sense of being guilty on a more fundamental level. And that guilt essentially is shame. It's the sense of shame for not being good enough. So I am guilty of not being good enough. Just in the same way we feel guilty for not having done something that we think we should have done, and we say, well, my actions weren't good enough in that example and I feel guilty. Then we can see that that can go deeper, where there's a fundamental sense of not being good enough in life. And then if that's the case, if that's the identity that gets put in place, whenever we're in daily life, whenever we're awake, in the waking state, there can be an underlying pervasiveness of a sense of worthlessness or incompleteness. A sense of abandonment is often very much linked to a sense of shame. Like, I must have been abandoned because I'm not good enough. So the abandonment is then interpreted to be a result of my unworthiness. And the same with rejection of different sorts other than abandonment. So there are these, there's this uncomfortableness, this suffering, and it manifests in practical terms as guilt, blame, pride, worry, and expectation, all of which are based on the idea I am the doer, the other is the doer, and the doer meaning the one in control of whatever happens through them, agent, independent agent, not affected by anything else, in complete control, in complete unaffected, essentially, not influenced by anything else, is the imagination we have of ourselves as a doer. And when we look at it in closer detail, we find that the human being, as I started off saying today, is not at all an independent agent that is not influenced by anything else. That's our idea of ourselves. I am an independent agent that makes my decisions on my own, not influenced by anything else. And so that's the idea of who I am as a doer. And when we look at how the human being develops, we find that they're completely influenced by factors outside of their control. Their genetic makeup, which is a result of the genes, the sperm and the egg coming together, and the genes of the parents. And that genetic makeup grows into a physical entity, and then that physical entity is impacted, shaped by the circumstance it finds itself in moment after moment after moment. So those are the only factors that determine or influence the development of the human being on a physical and psychological basis. The genes and up-to-date conditioning. And because there's no third factor, we can't possibly come up with a notion of free will, a notion of independent doership. We have to see, I am dictated to by life. What I am is a result of life, and I function according to what I am in the moment. And so an appreciation of that is an appreciation of I simply cannot be the doer. That doesn't mean that things don't happen. Things are always happening. Things are happening independent of a doer being present. Things don't need a doer, meaning some entity that is an independent agent, uninfluenced. We assume that needs to be there in order for things to happen, but that's simply because we don't appreciate that an instrument is shaped and designed and then it functions impersonally, meaning it functions without the need of an independent, separate agent, doer. If this is really grasped, which means we really need to think about it, and as we think about it, if all of the escape pathways that tend to be put in place by the psychological entity to somehow prevent a seeing, and they're not even, the escape pathways are not really actually put in place by the psychological identity. The escape pathways are in place because the conditioning of life has put those holes, you could say, holes in the container, in place. And so while those holes are in the container, our thinking simply can't grasp the magnitude of what's being said, because these other ideas, which I'm describing as these escape pathways, these other ideas are in place, and they just run contrary to what I'm suggesting. And what I mean by an idea is that this belief of an independent doer is so deeply ingrained. It's been established and put in place because life has been felt, experienced a particular way, day after day after day after day after day, without anything getting in the way of the way that life is experienced and the conclusions that are formed about what is going on in life in order for life to feel a particular way. And so what I mean by that is, from a very young age, we feel like I am an independent agent. That's what the life experience feels like. And so as a result of that continually being there, the assumption gets put in place. It feels like I'm an agent, therefore I must be an independent, separate doer. And that then means that the experience is taken as truth again and again and again, because it's just assumed it feels this way because I'm the doer. And all the other components of life that support that, the components on the surface of life that support that, are also locked away as a confirmation of the fact that I am a separate entity. And if I come in and suggest, hey, we're not a separate entity, there might be 10 main pillars holding up our idea that I am a separate doer in life. And those pillars are deeply ingrained structures, as I was saying, part of our neurological, the neural network that include these pillars. The biggest one, I hazard to say, must be the fact that life feels like I'm an independent doer, an independent agent. It feels like my choices are mine and mine alone, and what my choice is not influenced by anything else. It feels like that. And so the assumption, the unchallenged assumption, is it feels like that, so therefore that's how it is. And then underneath that there are, or within that, it feels like that because our thoughts feel like they are my doing. They feel like I am thinking, and I am thinking because of my capacity to think whatever I want in any moment. That's what it feels like. And so that becomes a sub-pillar under the pillar of it feels like it. And then it feels like my body moves because I move it. And I move it wherever I want, and so therefore I'm in control of moving my body wherever I want, and nothing else is influencing that. And so we can hear the explanation, and the explanation might undo some bits of our structure. But let's say the idea that I am the thinker, it's so deeply ingrained that what I'm saying doesn't penetrate as talking about that too. It doesn't penetrate as what Roger is talking about, is that the thinking is a result of the genes and up-to-date conditioning, and that there is no doer thinking. And so if it doesn't penetrate that it's about the thinking, then we might find, yes, I acknowledge that some of my actions are not my doing. For example, involuntary movement of the arm might be something that someone says, yes, that is not my doing. That just happened because it doesn't feel like there is a conscious choice to move the part of the body that moves involuntarily. And so that part is easier for someone to acknowledge as not their doing. But in acknowledging the bits that obviously feel like they're not my doing, in acknowledging that, there's a whole lot of other parts that don't go accepted as not being my doing. And that's why the process takes time. Because as, let's say, the outer layer of actions or thoughts or movements of the body, that there's some components will be seen as, yes, not my doing. And there'll be no appreciation of where the blind spot is, because a blind spot is a blind spot. And someone will say, I get it, I understand, I'm not the doer. But my suffering continues. Why is that? And I say, because you don't really understand on a complete level that you're not the doer. Because if one did, if the structure, if the neural network was changed such that there was a complete, total understanding that I am not the doer, the other is not the doer, then the suffering wouldn't arise. And so there's this gradual change that happens. And it could be today, someone might have heard in this explanation the inclusion of thinking as an action that feels very much like my doing. So my explanation that says, the reason that the belief in doership is put in place is because the experience feels like I'm a separate, independent entity. And we have to come to the point where we realize a feeling is not telling us the truth. A feeling is not infallible. And because feelings feel like they are truth, they feel like they are telling us the truth, we tend to make this mistake. It feels like it's telling us the truth, so it's the truth. We just need to look at feelings of anxiety, for example. A feeling of anxiety tells us that we are in great danger. And some people feel anxiety very, very regularly through their day or through their week or their life. And yet they find that the danger that the anxiety says is imminent, in practice doesn't eventuate. And so coming to see that feelings, and not just feelings of anxiety, but feelings of thinking someone is a great person the first time you meet them, and then you find down the track that they're not at all what you first thought. Any feeling, any thought, any human subjective experience is always possibly not what it seems. And so someone listening who's listened to the talks 10 times, 20 times, 100 times might hear this, which is a nuance that I'll mention from time to time, but I might not mention it every talk, and so they might not have heard the talks with it mentioned, or when it was mentioned in some talks that they heard, it didn't really grab them. And today it might be, wow, it feels like I am the doer. And a feeling doesn't mean it's true. Memory is another example of something that tells us it is like this. And we find time and time again that our memory is fallible. We might be convinced that the shops close at 4 o'clock. And if someone says, no, the shop closes at 5, no, I'm definite it closes at 4 o'clock. And then we find out it closes at 5 o'clock. And we realize, oh, it closes at 4 o'clock on the weekend, but during the week it's 5 o'clock. And at the time we might be convinced, no, it's 4 o'clock. But in fact, that's not the case. So there are any number of examples of thoughts, of feelings that are not telling us the truth. So when we investigate beyond the feeling, so the teachings are saying, take a look for yourself at life as it presents, investigate your own experience, follow the pointers, follow the concepts, and investigate and see if they hold water. And so the feeling of free will, the feeling of being a doer, doesn't necessarily mean that those actions that feel like they're your doing, uninfluenced by anything else, are actually like that. So the concept says, hey, whenever you do anything, whenever you make a decision, you're making a decision based on the circumstance that's not in your control. The circumstance turns out to be however the circumstance is in the moment. And you react, you interact with the circumstance. And what is interacting is the human being, genes and up-to-date conditioning, neither of which were in your control. And then the interaction leads to an output, an outcome, a reaction. And we take that reaction, that output, as my doing. And when we look at it, we see, how can it be my doing? I simply cannot be the doer. I find myself in a situation. The situation is whether there are 5 people in the room or 3 people in the room, whether it's noisy or not noisy, whether the options on offer are things I like or I don't like. None of that's in my control. So I find myself in a situation. And what is in the situation, a situation that's not in the human's control, is a biological instrument, a biological entity that is based on genes and up-to-date conditioning. And it functions, it reacts. This is the basis of non-doership. It's such a simple concept. And in a particular moment, there could be the exclamation, I simply cannot be the doer. That, in this teaching, is the insight that happens when it happens. It happens because the thinking starts to go down the path and grasps the important key points. And as it investigates its actions throughout the day, which is something that Ramesh used to suggest, he said, take 10 or 15 minutes at the end of the day or at the beginning of the day and take an action that has happened during the day that you are convinced is your doing, and then investigate it. And if you investigate it using the right rules, then we'll find whatever the decision was, or the action was, or the words in a conversation were, we'll find not my doing, because we'll investigate and we'll say, I was in a situation, the situation not in my control. I didn't set everything up in the situation. The situation is based on variables that are out of our control. And then what interacts with the situation? The body-mind organism interacts with the situation. And what is the body-mind organism? It is the current representation of the genes that came together when the sperm and the egg came together, and those genes started to grow, and that entity that started to form a physical entity was simultaneously impacted by new conditioning in the moment that becomes part of what we call the up-to-date conditioning. So the cumulative effect of all the new conditioning is the up-to-date conditioning. And so in each moment throughout our life, the human being was a result of its genes and up-to-date conditioning, and is always changing. And it's that entity that finds itself in a circumstance in life, reacting according to its genes and up-to-date conditioning and the circumstance it finds itself in. And so whenever we investigate this, we see that we saw something, we heard something, we tasted something, touched something, smelt something, all based on this entity being in the environment. And we weren't in control of what we saw, what we smelt, what we tasted, what we touched, what we felt, what we smelt. And as a result of seeing, smelling, tasting, touching, hearing, a reaction happens in the body. A thought arises, an action, a feeling. And following all of those movements, then something else happens. We have a thought, and then we might act on the thought. We have a thought, and the circumstances change, and we have another thought. And then there is an action. And all of that, all based on the same principles. Changing circumstance, so the thought arising becomes essentially new conditioning in the present moment. It becomes part of the circumstance that then leads to maybe an action. So what's the seeking about? Well, according to this teaching, the seeking is essentially about the end of suffering. So in practical terms, we see that we were born, we developed in life, and we started experiencing life. It was something that we couldn't avoid. So the baby started having an experience of life from probably before it was born. In the womb, it was also having an experience. And at some point, always, that experience is pervaded with a sense of who I am, and included in the experience is not only, so the experience is not only the visual and the sight and the sound, but the sense of who it is that is experiencing the world and what that means to the person that is experiencing the world. And so it turns out that the general standard development of a human being is to include an identity. So we develop to include a psychological identity that feels very uncomfortable in life. And until life changes that psychological identity, then as long as it remains in principle the same, then we will always feel uncomfortable in life. And spiritual teachings are one of the ways in which that psychological identity gets changed in a fast-track way. And why I say it gets changed in a fast-track way, not absolutely, not necessarily for everyone, but spiritual teachings are a form of new conditioning that are specifically aimed at highlighting the problem and suggesting solutions. And the solutions are not necessarily solutions as in this is how you can fix it, but the teachings can create solutions by delivering input that changes the identity without the identity even knowing what's happening. And so some teachings are not really intent on explaining, but they will just deliver a description of life that may actually be quite fantastical, maybe not even that accurate, but nonetheless enough to bring about at least the beginning changes that are needed. I think that there's also a role for a teaching that actually says let's leave behind some of the explanations that are not supported by what we can investigate for ourselves, not because those teachings are invalid, they're actually more valid for some people because of how the structure is. So if the structure's a certain way, telling someone how it is may not be at all effective. If the structure's a certain way, delivering certain blows or certain explanations of life might be far more effective to bring about change to the structure. My thought is eventually the identity is in a position that it can start to appreciate descriptions that are describing things in such a way that can be investigated and confirmed for oneself, rather than believing things that can't necessarily be confirmed, or believing explanations of things that can be felt that are explanations that at some point we'll see are not the explanations we will continue to run with, because they are not confirmable, that some of the concepts that describe what we feel, for example, the experience that one of the changes that happens is to know life from a different perspective, to be able to experience life from a less attached point of view. And that less attached point of view can feel like it is a point of view that is not coming from the body. And in order for that shift to happen, the teaching sometimes will suggest that you are not the body, and that information saying you are not the body can be very powerful at changing some of the structure. And then the experience changes, and life can be experienced from a less involved point of view that feels like we're not the body. And once again, because it feels that way, and because the concept that was delivered said you are not the body, then the assumption is, now I know myself as that which is not the body. And it's not that it's entirely untrue. What has been pointed at is awareness, and awareness came into view because it was described in relation to objects in a way that was different to the old structure, that changed the structure, and then the experience changed. But the statement that you are not the body, that you are formless awareness, is a relative truth. At some point we'll say, well, actually, how about I am a human being, and a human being is not either the body or awareness, but rather the human being is an aware physical entity. And we find that the statement that says, for example, we are not the body, we are awareness, may then leave out some components that still remain in our experience. After that realization, there are the experience still says that, well, whatever you know of life is not happening independent of the body. That's part of our that doesn't change. And so at some point we have to wonder whether that concept that says you are not the body, you are awareness, is absolutely true. Or does it need to get morphed to integrate the new awakening to the awareness aspect, and acknowledge that that always happens in conjunction with the experience of a body, and that it makes more sense at a certain point to refer to oneself as a conscious physical entity, which is not to say I am just a physical entity, but I am the combination of a physical instrument through which consciousness is functioning. Importantly, let's remember that the change is not about witnessing or oneness or knowing oneself as awareness. The change, the process, is about peace of mind. And peace of mind means a human being that used to suffer, and now suffering no longer arises. And the appreciation, the coming into view of one's consciousness can be a very significant part of the shift towards peace of mind. The appreciation of life as an experience or an arising within consciousness can be a very significant part of a shift towards peace of mind, because it can create an appreciation of objects, of thoughts, of emotions as being something that comes and goes, something that is not as true as we tend to relate to it in the moment. And as we process that and as we feel that, then what's happening is the structure is changing, and as the structure changes, the identification with those objects changes, and the qualitative experience of life that the human being is having changes from suffering to peace of mind, which is the end of suffering. And we see that the suffering is because there was this identification with thoughts as being absolute and real, identification with outcomes as being what I need in order to be complete. And as all of these relationships change, which in large part has to do with a recognition of a part of ourself that is independent or separate from, unaffected by the changing circumstance, and a capacity to rest there that allows the narrative that gets heavily involved in what's happening to be cut off more and more frequently. Because as we rest there, there is a sense of who cares? Whereas previously the experience wasn't who cares, the experience was this needs not to be like that. So very much caring. So suffering essentially is a movement that is forced upon us based on the human being being structured a particular way. So if someone says something about you, a friend, you hear that a friend was talking badly about you behind your back. If our structure is a certain way, there is no chance other than to get heavily involved in that and to feel like it needs to be rectified. In the same way, if your structure is a particular way, if someone challenges you, then there is no way but to get involved. An example of some structures is, for example, if you're listening to a conversation and the conversation is about something that you know about. And let's say the person says something inaccurate. You could have a certain makeup that forces you to say something. But there's no chance of not interrupting the conversation. Say, oh, excuse me, you said this, but I'm quite familiar with the subject and it's da-da-da-da-da. And that may be an impulsive habit or movement that you see. And it often we think, well, of course I'm going to say something. They've just said something and it's not right. It's inaccurate, so I'm going to correct it. It's for their benefit. And we might actually find that it's, when we look at it, that it's not as inevitable, or rather, it's not as much a choice of mine to add input into the conversation, but rather that I am compelled, based on my structure, to interject. And if that is part of a suffering dynamic, that may be a subtle suffering we might not realize. It may be if that's part of a suffering dynamic and something changes, at some point in the future we might find that impulse to jump in and add, when we hear someone say something incorrect about a subject we know, might not happen. It might be that now the thought arises, like, who cares? As in, not in a selfish way, but rather more of an understanding that that's their conversation. It's, if they're having an argument, you say, that's their argument. It's not for me to get involved. And that may be an attitude that someone might say, well, that doesn't make sense. I mean, you'd be helping them to get involved. It might mean that if you find yourself compelled to get involved in that situation, you also find yourself to get involved in many other sort of situations about yourself, or words about you, or comments about something you've done. And a certain structure will take those comments, those words very personally and get involved with them. And that's what's happening a lot at the moment in the world environment, especially when it comes to politics and other controversial topics. As soon as someone hears a topic, it creates an interaction, often with a sense of self, that is attached to outcomes. And so especially if it's something like travel bans, if someone is being affected, in a painful way by travel bans. As soon as they hear about travel bans, they have no choice but to get involved and to be on, on the side about the travel bans shouldn't be happening, without realizing that it's because the travel bans are delivering pain, and there's this compulsion to take that personally. And so then the topic is something you can't let go of. And an involvement in a lot of these topics may seem like it's social responsibility, etc., whereas I would suggest that a lot of it is a psychological involvement. And what happens is, and you can find out, you can see that it's a psychological involvement because it has its consequences. If it's a psychological involvement, it is suffering and it will feel uncomfortable. And as we engage in life in a way that makes us feel uncomfortable, there is a cumulative effect. And at some point, people will feel that this is not feeling good. And with enough awareness around the topic, there might be a realization, I need to stop being involved in this because it's triggering and it's dragging the psychological me into play. And so as that psychological me changes, what we find are these topics come up and we go, who cares? I really am not going to get involved in it because I know that the involvement in the topic is as fruitless as involvement in the past and blaming people, or the past and feeling shame. It's as fruitless as getting involved in the future and wanting outcomes to be a certain way, expecting outcomes to be a certain way. It's exactly the same principle. It's a form of attachment to outcomes, and it's not registered as that. And so, because it's not registered as that, we're compelled to move into it. People move into it, and their whole sense of self becomes about that. And as that identity starts to get weakened, we feel that we see that there is less involvement in a lot of situations and thinking about situations, and that lack of involvement translates into more and more capacity to be present with yourself and be present with the world that exists right now. And for the most part, the world that exists now doesn't include anything to do with all the things that we're thinking about. And what I mean by the world that exists now, I mean the present moment experience doesn't include politicians in it, doesn't include starvation in it. And if someone hears me say that, they might say, well, that's just irresponsible if you think that these things don't exist. And I'm not saying they don't exist. I'm saying that what we do is we infect the present moment with an inclusion of these things into the present moment on a habitual, relentless basis, which, when we look at it, isn't fixing the topics that exist somewhere in the world, but rather is disturbing the present moment experience. So I would say deal with the topics that exist to the extent that you can, and that isn't to gossip about them or to continually complain about them, but it's do what you can if there is something that can be done, and then let it go. And in letting it go, what appears is the clean present moment, free of the psychological me. And as the teaching is appreciated, we'll realize that the teaching mostly is pointing out the various movements, the movements of the psychological me, which are described as suffering, guilt, blame, pride, worry, and expectation, all based on the belief in personal doership. That means I am the one making it happen, the other is the one making it happen, whereas in fact, the concept that can be used to replace that, which is a more holistic and accurate concept, is everything is happening according to life's will. Life's will means the impersonal movement of life from the beginning of time and the unfolding of that up to the very present moment. And that movement will continue to happen, which means in each moment, events will happen, deeds are done, consequences will happen, but there has never been an individual separate doer of any of that. Life is a happening. So Ramesh used to point out the saying that I just mentioned by the Buddha. Events happen, deeds are done, consequences happen, but there is no individual doer thereof. So I think on that note, we can have some questions. Hi, Anita.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Hi, everyone. I had several questions, but they all came answered just while listening to you. But so I still want to, like, for example, I had a question, did your character change?
Well, the concept in the teaching, and remember, the concepts are not the truth, but they are presenting the framework in a way that is most useful. So the concepts will say, we're not really trying to change our character. We're not trying to make ourselves a better person. The change here...
Like, did the way you react to things change? And that's true. I mean, that for me, that is a yes. But what is your...
Well, the most significant change is on an attitudinal basis. So that's where the peace of mind lies.
Yeah.
And that's what the teaching is focusing on. So if we confuse that with our behavior changing, then we might be missing the point that the attitude of peace of mind doesn't require us to become a better, someone who is nicer in life, for example. That might happen, but that just means more pleasure. And what's really important is the attitude of letting go of life needing to be a particular way, which means letting go of the fact that sometimes we might not behave or act in the way that is nicest. We might snap at someone, for example. And if we snap at someone attitudinally, hopefully there is the understanding, yes, this happens, and we hopefully we can apologize, but at the same time we apologize without feeling shame, understanding that yes, that was just a result of the circumstance and my makeup.
Nice nuance. What I want is I am quite reactive, and my experience is that I'm becoming more and more myself, and so I feel there is more relaxation of who I truly, of how I am naturally responding to things. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
like so just don't mind my words too much now. So, so I wanted to be more tranquil. And just listening at you, I thought, yeah, I feel that already this space is opening up and that I'm already more tranquil in how I respond to things just because of this process that is going on. And and these last few months, I've been stuck with I am. And now I realize that the words were keeping me stuck. And then I heard Nisargadatta say, "I'll leave the I am," and then I thought, wow, then it was free. So I have been stuck for months just on the words I am, realizing that that it's not about the words, it's about. So next question. I feel like to get to stillness, to be in the stillness. It's difficult to say it in words, but okay. I have the experience that I can, if I think of a moment that I was in stillness, I can easily bring it back. Is that my imagination, or can I believe this? Can I trust this? I mean,
if it's happening, then there's no need to believe it. You just need to acknowledge that's how it happens. And I mean, remember, I wouldn't say you are bringing it back. I would say that the thought that remembers the potentiality of stillness arises, and then that thought leads to a consequence, and that consequence might be just a cutting off of the thinking mind that's happening at that time. And so it's not your doing, it's a happening because of everything that came before, which means the previous moment of stillness, a memory of the previous moment that arises especially when, let's say, the thinking mind is active, and then that memory cuts off the thinking mind and you find yourself back in the stillness. So yes, if it's happening, it makes sense.
Great. And triggered. For example, if you say be appreciative, I get amazingly triggered, which is beautiful, I think. So, because my mind goes, don't tell me how to be.
Yes.
So, because appreciation comes by itself. I wanted to share that just to, because I feel a difference between men and women. I have the experience that men get there by through thinking, and so if you give the man the words I am, then it's easier to access it than for a woman, I feel, because we use our feelings to get somewhere. That's my experience. Can you say something on that?
Yes. The concept in the teaching, so I keep going to the concepts because that's the teaching, right? So that's why I say the concept says that whatever I say is a description and not a prescription. So if I say abide in I am, you might get just as angry with me. Don't tell me what to do. And and so what I'm suggesting in that it's a description of what might happen and not a prescription of something to do, even though it sounds like a prescription. Because I know that life is unfolding according to destiny, according to our genes and up-to-date conditioning, and we're not in control of our genes and up-to-date conditioning. So I wouldn't possibly tell someone, abide in I am right now, because that would imply that they have control over abiding in I am. And I know that if their genes and up-to-date conditioning are not such that abiding in I am is going to happen in this moment, telling someone you as a doer should abide in I am is forgetting that none of us are doers and everything is happening according to life's will. So what it is just new conditioning that is thrown out based on my genes and up-to-date conditioning. And I understand that this new conditioning may land in such a way that maybe tomorrow or the day after, the thought in the seeker might arise, oh, abide in I am, what does that mean? And then maybe something else I said arises, and that thinking process can lead to a dropping into being. If that seeker with their genes and up-to-date conditioning, maybe they just need to remember abide in I am, because it's been happening before. Abide in I am, and they find themselves dropping into silence. And so what that means is it's not their doing, and I wasn't telling them you should do it, but rather it's a description of what might happen. So in the same way, if I say appreciation of life for the things, let's say gratitude arising, is, well, I don't know that I say be appreciative, but if I did say it's very hard to suffer when at the same time you are being appreciative. So whenever possible, be appreciative. That could be something that I might say, understanding that that's really a description of what might happen for someone, that at some point they might find gratitude arising. So that's what I have to say. Don't take it as a prescription.
And what last thing that I would like to discuss is a few months ago I was very, very clear, and then I found myself talking about these things with a kid, 13-year-old, and she was very receptive. And then I found that I shocked her with something I said. And this made me fearful of talking about this, and also in actually wanting to open up to all of this, because I thought I don't want to shock people. Mm-hmm. But then I was just listening now, and I thought, well, if I'm ready to cope with that, then things will open up by itself. But can you give me some guidance in that?
Yes, if you talk about these things and people get shocked, then it makes sense that you need to question it, for example, depending on what the consequence of that is. And so if you continually talk and it continually shocks people, or it continually gets people to react to you in a way that is not beneficial because they misunderstand what you're saying maybe, or any number of things, then you can take that as your cue to reassess, or to consider, should I be talking about this, just like you're suggesting. And at the same time, if you try again and people are receptive, then you get that feedback, and you might think, yes, I'll keep talking about it. So I think that's there isn't a should and a shouldn't, but it's rather we try something, and then our intelligence adjusts and refines what we do from each point forward.
Namaste. Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Thank you. Hello, Salt.
Hey, Roger, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Perfect. Let me just start by saying that I listened probably a couple of thousand times to your talks. And when I started out a few years ago, it felt like it was really clicking on an intellectual level. Mm-hmm. And then, experience, my life didn't really agree with that. It didn't sink in, so it became frustrating after a while. So I gave it some rest, and then more recently, I've been listening to your talks again, and now it's very different. So it seems to be sinking in now. It's not only the intellectual understanding anymore, but life seems to be reinforcing it. So gratitude for that. Seems to be life changing right now.
Great.
And then the questions I have, they are kind of nuances, not really like great problems or anything. The first question I have is like if you could provide a more clear distinction between the working mind and the thinking mind. I mean, I get the difference between the two, but like let me give you an example. Say I listen to one of your talks, and then I go have a shower, and in the shower, I could be present and feeling the water touch my skin, but I won't, and the mind will be processing the information that was just heard. And so, what is that? Is that contemplation? Is that in between, or how would you classify that? And it's not necessarily problematic, but it resembles or it reminds the old pattern where thinking is more exciting than being present.
Yeah, so it depends. You can see how easily we set up an objective of being present, for example, and if we set up the objective of that it's about being present, and we have our definition of what present means, then we lose track of the fact that maybe it's about the end of suffering. And we might have an idea that presence means being present with the physical environment, right? So you might find yourself, if you're on your phone or you see someone else on their phone, you might say, oh, they're not being present. I'm not being present with the environment. Now, that to me is an imposition. It's a bit like a should and a shouldn't, because you might need to, from a functional point of view, be on your phone. And I don't mean on a functional point of view where you're lost, and you're using maps to find yourself. It's like, who knows what the present moment is meant to be utilized for? So, you could be outside in the garden and thinking about a tax problem, right? Which, like, I don't mean thinking about the fact you have a tax problem and life is terrible because you have a tax problem, but maybe you're trying to work out how to minimize a capital gain on a share transaction or something like this. And that thinking is functional thinking. It is not the thinking of the thinking mind where there is an uncomfortableness in the form of guilt or blame or pride or worry or expectation. And for us to insist that I need to spend the time in life being present with the present moment, as in, sorry, I won't say present with the present moment, because one of my other points is that when you're thinking about the tax problem, that is not being present. You are being present with the working mind. Now, so why is it that there is this emphasis in teachings to be present with what is right now? And often what is right now and being present with what is right now is encouraged to be present with not with thinking, not with the thinking mind or the working mind. So there is a preference or a favoring being present with the sensations as opposed to any thinking. And the reason for that is that our thinking has become habitual, and for as long as the thinking mind is in place, as long as the psychological me is in place, what we will tend to do is be thinking as part of an attachment to outcomes. And so our thinking, when it's very habitual, will tend to disturb an appreciation of something that is known in the absence of thinking. And that component that I'm talking about, the appreciation of the awareness and the sense of existence, is very important at disarming and atrophying the psychological me. So for as long as the psychological me is very strong, a teaching will keep encouraging, just like I often say, abide in I am. Now, abiding in I am, in its initial stages, means stop thinking, all thinking, including the working mind thinking, and just rest in being, which means you really need to be present with the sensations, the experience, the feeling. And the reason, as long as we understand the reason, that's because abiding in I am, being present, is effective at stabilizing our connection with that part of ourself. And that connection with that part of ourself is most useful at being able to cut off the thinking that we used to be really attached to, the thinking mind thinking. Once the thinking mind thinking has subsided, then the insistence on abiding in I am, the insistence on being present with the present moment, can fall away. And if you found yourself thinking in the shower and it was a functional thinking, then your peace of mind hasn't been disturbed. If we mistake peace of mind for abiding in I am and not thinking at all, then we start to insist on, oh, I need to be more present, which might actually be an imposition on how life really wants to unfold. Because in the shower, you might be contemplating, which could be very practical. And so an insistence of not contemplating in that moment might be interfering with the natural flow of life.
Super helpful, thank you. The other question I had is about shame in the moment, if such a thing exists. I mean, I find your categories of biological and psychological, these two categories of emotions and the distinction between them very helpful, especially for anger, so that we don't start to expect anger to go away. What I wonder about is whether shame in the moment, as in when you do something embarrassing and your face goes red, that to me seems very biological as well. Wouldn't you want to, make this distinction that that's like vertical, feeling shame in the moment, and then there's no issue with that, and then if it drags on, that's where it gets problematic?
Yeah, I'd be happy to run with that. I wouldn't use the word shame in that case. I think the word embarrassment is better, because shame is kept, the word shame is kept for the psychological and horizontal involvement. Because even in the in anger, even if anger is just not horizontal and it just happens, if it's pure anger, it won't have blame in it. Now it might seem like it has blame in it, because the words will say, why did you do that? Right? Which sounds like blame. But blame is a feeling. Blame is not the words. The words, why did you do that, could be just part of the anger. The blame is a feeling of the uncomfortableness. So in the biological anger, there is no blame. And in the biological embarrassment, I would say there is no shame, but there is the biological embarrassment of something, not great happening. Let's say you give a talk and you really mess it up, and you forget your lines, and you, in that moment, you feel embarrassment coming over you, but not to the point where it turns into shame. So if shame arises just for a few seconds, and it's not embarrassment but it's shame, then what I would suggest is that we call it suffering, but short-lived suffering. In the same way, if when you get angry and it's short-lived, there is blame in the anger, then we call it short-lived suffering. And it can be very tricky to know the difference between anger and blame, because on the outside, a lot of biological anger will look like blame. And so what we need to do is we need to start following the pointer that says suffering is an uncomfortableness with oneself and an uncomfortableness with the other. And if we become familiar with the uncomfortableness when it's very clearly suffering, and it's horizontal, and it's got doership in there, and it's got attachment to outcome, if we become familiar with the uncomfortableness there, then when there is a short burst, if it has uncomfortableness in it, we will know, oh, that's the same as the very obvious suffering, but in a short version of it. And if there is anger without the uncomfortableness, we will be able to feel, wow, this doesn't have the uncomfortableness in it, but there is a biological reaction of anger. And let me just add that if there is long horizontal suffering, so anger with blame in it, or there is short psychological suffering, anger with blame, but just short-lived, we also have to appreciate that that suffering is not our doing. And so ultimately, a non-involvement in the suffering is very important. So the only reason it's described differently is so that our attention can land on it and see the difference between the biological reaction and the attitude to the circumstance, including the biological reaction. But then our attitude to the attitude needs to be the same as it's just a happening, not my doing. Because if someone hears me talk about biological reactions as opposed to a biological reaction with the attitude of suffering, very easily we can form the idea, oh, I shouldn't have any suffering. And the fact is that suffering will arise according to our makeup, and our makeup wasn't in our control, and therefore the suffering isn't in our control. So if there is suffering, along with the biological reaction, hopefully our attitude becomes eventually an attitude of, what to do. Yes, there was some blame there, but it was a happening.
Thank you. And the last question, if I may.
Sure.
It's about children. Basically, the previous listener touched on this, but at what point would it be a good idea teach children non-doership, or at what point would you do this, and or would it make more sense to have them grow up as like all children do, and or already at a young age not praise them and not make them feel pride or or guilt, or how would you approach this?
Well, I think with any teaching, in order for it to be a good teaching, there needs to be what's referred to as skillful means. And so this in Buddhism in particular, this concept of skillful means is referred to where a teacher really understands deeply the topic fully, and then can say what is needed to be said for the particular person that they're talking to. And so it means it's not just rote learning or repeating something that they have heard. It's about really being able to adjust what is said for what's in front of them. And so when it comes to children, this process of skillful means is going to be very important, because if it isn't included in the mix, we very well could deliver a certain type of conditioning that will have a particular effect on the child that might not be ideal for a child's development. And we can't exactly know this and do anything about it, because if that happens, it's the child's destiny. It's part of what you are delivering is part of their up-to-date conditioning. And you may be doing it with the very best of intention, and you may at the same time, without knowing it, be delivering a certain new conditioning that doesn't deliver a good result for the child. But we can't control what we deliver. We can be aware of the fact that maybe this is not good for the child, like you're obviously considering by asking the question. And I think that being aware of that and moving forward with that in mind is a very good start. So if I was a parent, I think I would be delivering it from the very beginning, but like from when a child is born. But the question is, what is it that I would really be delivering? Because would I be delivering the same talk that I'm giving now? And I think the answer is no. I think what would be delivered is a version of this that appreciates what the key points are, and appreciate how best to deliver those points to a child in a way that doesn't interfere with a certain development. And the fact is, I could get it wrong, but I know, because I've thought about it, that I would actively be delivering something in a way that wasn't a doctrine, it wasn't dogmatic, and allowed a child to appreciate the difference between pleasure and pain. So, if they leave their toys on the floor, I'd say, my preference is that you don't leave your toys on the floor. So when I come into the house and the toys are there, it's not what I like. But I also understand that I'm not always going to get what I would like. And that's life. So there are ways that we can introduce it where it's not really about the teaching, but rather it just gets infused in the way that we interact with the child.
That's very helpful, and that's in line with what I had in mind. Probably not easy to execute. But anyway, very helpful. Thank you very much. Keep up the good work.
Thank you. I'm glad that the understanding has got to a point where you are feeling an experiential benefit. That's great to hear. Ami? Hello, Abhimanyu. Yes, hello.
I'd like to thank you first for the satsangs and the wonderful videos that you put out on YouTube. And I've been recently listening to you. It's probably been just about a month or so. And I fairly get the concepts, intellectually. And sometimes, like you said, that it happens automatically. I find myself in situations where I'm telling myself that probably this is blame or this is expectation. So that sense is happening for me very, very slowly. And then my friend who's been following you for a very long time, Vikram Shetty from Pune, he suggested that I be a part of the satsangs and where I can interact with you directly. So my question to you is, the concept of non-doership and not to be attached with the outcomes, it makes very clear sense. And when I'm looking at other things in life and not very close and intimate relationships, that is where it is easy to kind of correlate with that and understand that. But when it gets to, say, my kids or my spouse, everything falls out of the window. And then when I get back to listening to your videos, that again makes sense and I come back. But practically, in the closer relationships, it's not happening. You have something to say about that?
Yeah, well, yes. What we need to appreciate is the fact that if the suffering, if the involvement is happening, it's because the psychological me is in place. Now, so it's a simple matter of deduction that we see the suffering happening, and we have to sort of reverse engineer an answer. Why is that happening? And if we have the answer that says, that's because the psychological me is still in place. Now, then we say, why is it not happening when something happens with a stranger? And so then we say, okay, the psychological me is in place and triggered by actions from loved ones or people that are close, family, etc. But it's not triggered by impersonal interactions or things that happen with strangers. And so then you can deduct, okay, so the understanding is starting to seep in. The psychological me is not being triggered by strangers, whereas it previously might have been in those situations also. And now it's not, but with family members it still is. And so there doesn't have to be a resistance against that. There just has to be an understanding why. And the understanding why is simple. The psychological me that is taking what family members do as personally, with an attachment to them not doing that, is in place. And so an example of this is we're looking for love from the other, or looking for pleasure from the other, which is we take it as a form of love. If someone does what I like, then they love me. If they don't do what I like, then they don't love me. And when we're seeking love, one of the most classic places that we look for love is in romantic relationships, for example. We set up a romantic relationship because we think that's where we will get love. And we don't really look for love in the same intense way with a stranger. And so it makes sense that when our close family members do something that isn't in line with our preferences, it's taken more personally, because that's where we're looking for most of our love, from the people close to us. And strangers, we say, yeah, that's, they don't know me, so I don't have so many expectations on them. And so then that's the reason. And if we understand the reason, then there's likely to be less resistance to it. Understanding why something is happening is often one of the most important components of us not getting involved in it anymore, especially if we can appreciate that the psychological me that is looking for love or looking for attachment to outcome, which is a form of seeking for love, if we see that that is how life has developed us, that we can't really be different until life changes us, then we see this reaction and we say, what to do.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Say hello to Vikram for me.
We'll do that. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay. I think we'll take one more question for now. Hi, Carolina.
Hi, Roger. Many thanks for the satsang. I would like to be sure if I understand your point about the doer.
Mm-hmm.
When you can be the doer, is because you mean that our nature and it doesn't do things?
Well, no, because our nature functions, but our nature can only function one way, however it is. Well, actually, I see what you mean. Yes, there's two ways of looking at it. We're not the doer because... So it depends what you mean, but it depends how you see yourself in a particular moment. If you are resting in the core of the human being, the essence of the human being, what is called sometimes our true nature, we realize that our true nature is only capable of watching. It doesn't do any thinking, it doesn't do any speaking, it doesn't do any acting or any behavior. All of that is the biological and the psychological. And the essence of who we are knows itself to be not the doer of any actions, any speaking, any thinking. It knows itself to be the witness. And I think that's what you were asking. Is that why we are not the doer? Because what our true nature is the simple witnessing of everything that is happening. And that is very much one perspective of the 2 points, the 2 ways of knowing ourself as not the doer. One is to abide in that which is aware, and that which is aware knows it to be not that which is happening, but rather that which is aware of what is happening. The other reason, which is more of the integrated perspective, the other reason we are not the doer is when we see that what we are is a person, which includes the physical and the consciousness functioning together. So now we're not saying I am just the formless awareness, aware of everything that is happening, but we are more integrated in saying, actually, I am a human being, and I have to live my life centered in the body, but aware that whatever is happening through the body, the speaking, the thinking, the actions in the moment, are happening according to my nature, you could say. Not the same essence that we were talking about before, but my nature as a person, which includes the genes and up-to-date conditioning. So that means that the thinking is happening one way, the responding to the situation is happening one way, and that way is according to my makeup as a complete human being, which includes the body and all the thinking. But that human being is designed not by itself. The human being didn't design itself. So the human being isn't the one doing whatever happens. The human being was designed by life. So this is where the concept that says, I am being lived. I am not the doer, but I am rather being lived by life. So whatever I do in practice, the speaking, the actions, the thinking, whatever I do is a happening and not my doing. So definitely, in a practical sense, I say, I am the one washing the dishes. I am the one walking. I am the one that broke the vase. But those things happened as a happening according to God's will, or a happening according to life's will, and not a happening according to me as a separate independent entity, in complete control of everything that I do in any moment. So whichever way you look at it, we're not the doer.
And I have according with this, but always when you are doing something, one part is doing something, but another part is like the witness that is watching that you are doing, and this part is like the conscious.
Yes.
And when you are in conscious way, you are connected to your I am. No matter this part doesn't mind what happened outside, and this part, when you are in this part, this is something that is happening for grace or for the destiny, or it's something that if you try to be conscious in any moment, it happens, or it's not your person, it's your true nature, verdadera naturaleza. But
yes.
When you cover this part, you always can be conscious about that. Sometimes you sleep and sometimes no. It happened for grace, or it happened for the destino, or why?
I'm not sure of the question. So I understand that you say you can find yourself resting in being that is just witnessing everything that is happening, and then you're asking about can it happen for days?
I said, when you are conscious, you are the witness, and you see the life, you are living with you as you are, as I am. No? And
yes.
when it happened for grace, or
for grace,
it happened for the thing, because always when you are doing something, if you stop a little bit you can see, I know something is watching this doing.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And
so you can call it grace. Grace basically means it happened and I didn't make it happen. So I am thankful that it happened. So we say the word grace, the way I use it, is when something good happens, something beneficial happens, and we understand, wow, this really wasn't my doing, because sometimes it doesn't happen and now it happened. In the same way, surrender, if we are heavily involved in something and suffering, and then suddenly this surrender can come over us, and all the suffering dissolves. And if that happens for someone, they say, wow, that was grace, because I didn't do it. I was lost in the suffering. And then all of a sudden, surrender happened. And I didn't do the surrender, but surrendering happened. And so the person can say, that was grace. Now, my explanation is that happens like that because the identity, or the person, the human being, their internal structure is changing. It's changing from having a very strong psychological me, and the psychological me is getting weaker because of a process that is happening: contemplation, listening to satsangs, doing meditation, a whole lot of things that is changing the psychological me. And when the me gets weaker and weaker, we start to find more and more movement into being, or witnessing, or non-involvement, more surrender. And on the one hand, it can sound like, oh, so I am doing that because the psychological me is getting weaker, and therefore, because of listening to satsangs and meditating. But if we look at it from the explanation that the teaching puts forward of non-doership, it says, if you find yourself listening to satsang, it's because there was a feeling that said, oh, in this moment I would like to listen to satsang. And that feeling was not your doing, it was part of destiny. And so then what happens as a result of satsang is not your doing, but part of destiny. So if the psychological me is weakening as a result of listening to satsang, that is grace. Because you found yourself wanting to listen to satsang because of grace, meaning a feeling arose that said, yes, I'm going to listen to satsang, and it arose day after day after day. And if contemplating happened, it happened because of grace. A result of your genes and up-to-date conditioning led to the thinking. And the same, if you feel like sitting in meditation, and you sat in meditation and things changed as you meditated more and more frequently, that was grace. And so these movements into peace of mind, where the suffering falls away, is, on the one hand, we can say grace, but on the other hand, we can appreciate it's a result of change, it's a result of a process, it's a result of new conditioning, changing our up-to-date conditioning. But how the new conditioning changes our up-to-date conditioning, and what new conditioning is delivered, is not in my control. So it was grace.
But, for example, I don't know if, because I know the difference, sometimes when I am doing anything, say, you can go by to do the things that you need to do, or sometimes you say, okay, let's stop, and to be as the witness.
Mm-hmm.
But I feel that this is, I don't know if this part comes from the person or from the I am. because in any moment I try to stop and see. This is not what I am. Let's watch, okay, and let's continue. But I don't know if this part comes from is real or is not real, is from my true nature or is from the person. You know, I in the middle from the person and the I am, and I don't know when it is happening, or I need to complete surrender, or to feel that I'm not doing, but one part doesn't feel comfortable because really want to be, you used to be conscious.
Yeah, so really I wouldn't look at it as being the person or the I am. I would look at it from either the belief in personal doership and attachment to outcome, which is an aspect of the human being, or it is coming from a functioning of the human being that doesn't include attachment and doership. So a human being can be free of the belief in doership and attachment to outcome, or, as we very well know, the human being can be driven by doership and attachment to outcome. And so if in a particular moment the person is functioning with this belief in personal doership, I'm in control, I can make this happen, I need to make it happen because I want this outcome. If that's what was happening, if that's what is arising, where we say, let me just stop and be, but with this attitude of doership and attachment to outcome, then we find it doesn't experientially happen. So the doer part of the person, the doership and the attachment, can't ever witness. It actually is the opposite of witnessing. It is full involvement. And on the other hand, it is always the person. So when we have the thought, stop, and it's not from doership and attachment, it's just from a strengthening of this movement into that place where it's happening naturally, then it's still, that's the person, that it's the human being, but it's not the human being with the doership and attachment part functioning strongly. So these different words in different teachings are, it's up to the seeker to reconcile them, because you listen to another teaching that talks about the person being the same as the doer. Now, I don't refer to the person and the doer as the same thing. I say we are all people, we are all egos, and there is an ego that either has the deep belief in doership and attachment to outcome, and that is how that ego is functioning, or there is an ego where that belief in doership and attachment to outcome is weakening, and so sometimes that person, that ego, and the ego doesn't go anywhere, the ego doesn't die. We are an ego. Ramesh was an ego, Ramana was an ego, all the enlightened masters were egos, but without the belief in personal doership and attachment to outcomes. So there can be a person, an ego, where the belief in doership and attachment to outcome is getting weak. And when it's getting weak, sometimes there will be this witnessing. And as it gets weaker and weaker and weaker, there's more and more witnessing. And when the belief in doership and attachment is completely dissolved, then you could say witnessing is always happening and there is no suffering.
I see the attachment, okay? Mm-hmm. And I see the witness, and I see the witness is in touch, and I see the person that is suffering, and like sometimes I can separate I cannot, is maybe I say it's not very important, but one part is suffering and I identify the other part that is untouched.
Mm-hmm.
But it's uncomfortable because you have both inside.
Yes, so that's a phase that happens where there is still suffering, and the suffering is witnessed. And we say, no problem that there's suffering, because what is witnessing it is untouched by the suffering. And that is a phase of the process. Eventually the suffering falls away, and so then there's no question of witnessing suffering. When the suffering, even the primary suffering falls away, then we don't even need to witness the suffering. And it's a happening when this, when you find witnessing of the suffering there, like you said, I can be the witnessing the suffering. I think it's very important attitudinally to realize that happens sometimes. It's not your doing. It's a result of your changing structure, that we very much can witness suffering, and when there is the witnessing of the suffering, there is this sense that what I am is not touched by the suffering. And that is a degree of freedom. That is much more peace than when there is involvement in the suffering. I wouldn't say it is total peace of mind, because there is still the primary suffering, but it is a very, very significant shift when there is witnessing of suffering. It's a huge improvement, so much so that people will say, I don't care that there is still suffering, because when there is the witnessing of the suffering, I know myself as the witness, and I am not the suffering. But if you think about it, what if even that suffering dissolves? Then it is even more freedom. But we shouldn't set this up as, oh, even more freedom, I want that, because then there will be more attachment to, no suffering at all. So what you're describing is very good. I'm sure you appreciate that it feels much, much lighter than when there is involvement in the suffering and no witnessing.
Also, because I live with both sometimes, but it's true that maybe the suffering is less every day, not every day, every moment, maybe, because now I don't care about the result, about anything.
Mm-hmm.
I only want to surrender to God, and no more. But in the process, I am living this kind of things. I say, what should I not do? But what should be my attitude? There is something that I only surrender, or I don't know.
No, just have the attitude that it is all happening according to God's will. The times when there is witnessing, it's a happening. The times that there is involvement, it's a happening. And just let life unfold. Life is always unfolding. There has never been a doer. There never will be a doer. And you are not making it happen. You are the one that is watching it unfold, with the attitude that it's all happening according to God's will.